You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. All right, everyone, welcome back. We have a really awesome episode here for you today. I am excited because you all are about to get some free marriage counseling. Whether you realized it or not, whether you think you need it or not, you're getting it. Not quite, but we are talking about a marriage book today. And as someone who was in training for ministry, was in ministry before, I've done counseling, I have read a lot of marriage books. And honestly, not all of them are great. In fact, a lot of them tend
Yeah.
to lean into interpretations of the Bible that are not always healthy. They can be misogynistic, and a lot of times they just end up repeating the same thing, same formula from a slightly different angle. This book that we're talking about today is not one of those. I like to fancy myself a little bit of a writer. I don't think I'm as good of a writer as I like to think I am, but I have wanted to write on marriage for a while. And as I was reading this book, sitting across from my wife, Jana, I said, darn it, this guy wrote the book I wanted to write, and he wrote it better than I would have. So, with us here today, we have Dr. Dana Robert Hicks. Dr. Hicks, thanks for being on here with us.
Oh, Connor, or Colin, excuse me. So great to be with you. Colin Connor, that messes me up, but
Right?
it's the guy with two first names, so
You are not alone there. I'm just
okay.
glad that my parents didn't take one man's advice and name me Connor, do EROR.
Oh Lord. No,
But
it's great to be here though. Thank you, Colin.
yeah, yeah. So Dana and I had the chance to meet at Theology Beer Camp a few months ago because I was talking to Tom Ward, finally got to meet him in person. And if you all listen to our episode, our second episode with Tom, where we talk about deconstruction and his book he did with Tripp, he got us connected with Eric Seibert at that point. And so when I met up with him at Beer Camp, he already started doing that again. So very shortly after we met in person, he said, have you met this guy, Dana Hicks, yet? I'm like, no, I haven't seen him around. He said, all right, we
Tom
gotta
is the
find him. Well,
ultimate networker, man. Tom
right,
knows
right.
everybody. It's
He
crazy.
really does. And the second he said Dana Hicks, I swear it was like manifesting this guy out of thin air. He walks out of the room right next to us, and Tom says, there he is.
Yeah. I've,
So,
what's that movie where you say the guy's name and he appears? The
the Beetlejuice we got going on for a
Beetlejuice. Yes,
second.
I'm
Say
like
Dana Hicks, Dana Hicks,
Beetlejuice.
Dana Hicks.
Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice.
It's showtime.
That's right. Just be careful. And then you get marriage counseling, apparently.
Right. But Dana was super nice right off the bat and said that he had a couple of books he had written recently, generous enough to hand those over to me and say, hey, read these and let me know if you want to talk. And so I picked up his marriage book, The Knot, which I have here at my desk, and it's called The Knot: How to Secure Healthy Modern Relationships While Not Being Tied to Marriage's Past. So if that title does not get you interested, I don't know what will. And Dana, you know what? I'm just going to read this off of the Amazon bit about the author here because I think this is just great. It says, Dr. Dana Robert Hicks is an Amazon best-selling author, public theologian, and ecclesiastical disruptor. Now, Dana, I just want you to know, as soon as I read that, I'm getting my business cards changed. The name on the door is getting fixed. All right, that is an awesome title to have by your name. There's ecclesiastical disruptor.
Yeah, it doesn't fit neatly on a business card, but it's a fun title. Yeah.
It says your writings revolve around the themes of culture, change, and spirituality. So, way to have some job security there. Like those are always things you can talk about.
That's true. It's always changing.
Yeah. So I read through this book and, I'll just break form a little bit here, not even wait until we get to the end of the episode. I will just tell you all listening, get this book. Whether you are in a relationship, married, not in a relationship at all, not married, wherever you fit on the spectrum, this book can help because it's the sort of thing that I would say is actually almost better if you can read it earlier.
Yeah.
And even if you don't end up agreeing with everything in it, I think even early on, you write in there, like, you don't have to agree with me on this stuff, but it gets you thinking. It's going to challenge you, and I think it'll also encourage you to realize that, I think if we're all honest, sometimes reading like marriage books and that
Mhm.
it can get discouraging because we don't always feel like we fit the mold.
Right.
And I think this book does a lot to say that's not you. Maybe it's the
Mhm.
system. So let's just
Yeah.
get right into
Yeah.
this. Dana, you shared some really shocking info in the book, like
Mm.
how Christians are actually more likely to get divorced than
Mhm.
non-Christians.
Yeah. Evangelical
Marriages,
Christians. Yeah.
yes, specifically evangelicals. Thank you. Mar Marriages tend to benefit men's health while detracting from women's. And then there is the airplane analogy. And oh my word, this was on like page 5 and it slapped me upside the head, It's pretty early on. Yeah, there's a common statistic, I'm sure we've all heard it. Around 50% of marriages are going to end in divorce. And Dana just comes out of nowhere and says, "Well, would you get on an airplane that only had a 50% chance of survival?" Like, no. So you suggest in the book that when an institution fails more than it succeeds, we should
Mhm.
reconsider the institution. So talking about marriage here, why do you think marriage is at a point that it needs to be rethought? And why now? I mean, hasn't it been working for thousands of years? Like, what is it that gets you to the point that you think I should write this book to say that we need to rethink marriage here in whatever it was 2023 or when you wrote the book?
Yeah, yeah. Well, my thinking on all of this really began. Somebody gave me a book by a woman named Stephanie Kuntz called Marriage: A History, and
Mm.
she's just a historian. She has no, as far as I know, she has no religious background or anything. Just writes from a general historical framework. And it really blew my mind to begin to understand what I had always assumed, that marriage was pretty much the same, throughout history. Turns out that no, not even close. Marriage has evolved a lot throughout history and functioned in different ways for society and for individuals and families throughout history.
Mm.
And so when we say marriage, it's really such a broad term in terms of historically speaking. And so to say, so when you ask the question, what makes us think that marriage should be reinvented, now, or rethought now, I
Mm.
guess my gut response to that is because it's always been rethought. It's
Mm.
constantly changing. I think it's only our own lack of understanding to understand that marriage, we think that somehow marriage as it's been the last 200 years is the way in which it's always been, which it hasn't.
Mm.
So
I know plenty of people who would just think right off the bat, as soon as they hear us talking about marriage, that marriage is ordained by God in the Bible and it's
mhm,
defined in very limited parameters.
mhm.
So, you talk about the institution of marriage failing, and I think a lot of those people would say, well, that's just human error. Obviously, the system is perfect because God set it up. So how
Mhm.
might you respond to
Mhm.
someone coming at it from that sort of angle?
Yeah, so marriage as it's defined throughout the scripture, I mean, there's a bazillion ways that marriage is defined in the Bible itself. You think
Mm.
about, most marriages in the Hebrew scriptures, wealthy people had polygamous marriages, that was sort
Mm.
of the way they rolled. And women were seen primarily as property, didn't really have a lot of rights. To, when you took the virginity of your neighbor's daughter, the
Mm.
violation was a violation of property, not a violation of her personhood, you know.
Even built into the section that's talking about violating property, too, in that
Exactly.
particular passage. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the common forms of marriage in the Hebrew scriptures is what's called the Levirate marriage or Levirate
Mhm.
marriage, in which a man dies, and his brother is obligated to take his wife and his kids as his own. So, if we want to talk about biblical marriage, I mean that could be a form of biblical marriage. So,
Yeah.
when we talk about marriage, again, how marriage functions in a society changes constantly. And so, often in the ancient world, it was a way of demarcation of property. As marriage sort of evolves, it becomes a way of uniting clans and families and tribes together. So people would
Mm.
marry, so that, oh, now my cows can graze in your pastures, kind of thing. I mean, that was sort of
Right.
the motivation. For a lot of human history, marriage was about, the goal of marriage was survive. That was sort of the thing, you could marry somebody so that you could actually work the farm together and have enough to eat. That was your motivation. That was the goal. The idea of like, I want to be happy in my marriage, that just wasn't a question.
Yeah.
Really, happiness in marriage is a question that's only come about really in the last 200 years. Did people begin to say, what I'd really like is if I loved my partner. In fact, for a lot of human history, in the Middle Ages, they often thought of if you had a lot of affection for your partner, that was problematic because that could create a lot of tension in the marriage, right? And so even again, it's so counter to the way we think today. It's hard to think that throughout human history, it's evolved so much. Even in the day of Jesus bashes on marriage quite a bit. Paul tells his brothers, don't even get married. If you have to get married, fine. If you're going to burn with lust, do it. But it's best if you don't. Marriage sucks. But, we don't quote those sorts of things, right? I mean, and it's right there. It's in the Bible, but nobody ever pays attention to that part because, again, we have this modern concept of marriage that, that's really generated more from, Walt Disney and rom-coms than it is from the Bible.
Let's dig into that thought for a second there, because when you're talking about the Bible and like Paul and Jesus, because I can hear some alarm bells going off in people's heads where they're like, whoa, what is he talking about here? Growing up in church, I only ever heard marriage being pushed as the end all be all. Like this is what you're leading up to. You need to get married and you're whole. And you point out both in the book and even just a second ago here that both Jesus and Paul actually are dismissive of marriage. But if I were to walk into a church today and say, you're all putting too much stock into this thing, there's more important things out there, other relationships can be better, brother, I'd get kicked out or prayed over and then kicked out.
Apparently so would Jesus, because he never married, right? I mean,
Right,
we always say, well, what would Jesus do? Well, apparently he wouldn't marry,
Isn't that crazy?
If you want to follow in the footsteps of the rabbi, this is, don't get married. And I'm not saying a person shouldn't get married.
Right,
I'm just saying
right.
that
Within that
again, this
mindset.
just gets back to our modern, the lens through which we see marriage is much more modern than it is really biblical or Christian in that sense.
So why do you think then that the church came to glorify marriage while basically sweeping under the rug those passages where Paul and Jesus both seem to take a different perspective?
Wow. Where do I start? I think, Colin, I think one of the dangers of, and not just Christianity, probably every religion and every time in human history, is that we project onto God our own desires and wishes and ideas and then sanctify them and assume that God wants it that way. So I think that's a temptation for every generation, that we project with the old saying, God created man and man returned the favor, and created God in his own image,
Right.
and we project onto God what we think we're like, what we think. And there's a lot of evangelical culture right now looks a whole lot more like the Republican Party than it does like Jesus, because they're projecting onto this idea of God and Jesus, ideas that are, again, much more have to do with Republican policies and Republican talking points than they do with anything that Jesus said. And so they always run into trouble when they actually read the Bible, which I think is hysterical, But I think that's true in relationships too. We really want to believe in this romantic notion of, that there's the one person out there, this magic person. And if we just discover this person, this soulmate, that, our lives will be so easy and relationship we'll never fight. We'll always get along. They'll always know what I need before I even ask. I won't even have to work at this. It'll just happen. And then, of course, that's an illusion. And when we actually are in a relationship and realize, oh, this actually takes work, and I have to like communicate, and I have to be
Right.
vulnerable, and I have to
Yeah.
do the hard work of all this, then we either become disillusioned with marriage, or we think, oh no, I married the wrong person, because this is hard
Hmm.
work,
Yeah.
which a lot of people do too.
Yeah, I
So
think everyone would say, "Oh, I know those Disney relationships don't ever happen or the Hallmark romance movies," but
yeah.
it's so baked into our thinking that
Hmm.
even if you hate that kind of movie, you kind of think of relationships that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just you really got me thinking as I was reading the book about how much has changed in just a couple hundred years of human history
Hmm.
and how pragmatic marriage was. Like you said, it was about survival. It was about, let's have somebody to take care of me when I get older. Let's have somebody to take the farm over so my enemy over there doesn't take my farm from me. But I think a couple different points in the book, you say that till death do us part meant something different when you live to 40 instead of married for 40 years.
Yeah, yeah. If you're only going to live to be, if 35 is an old man, and you
Right.
say till death do us part, it's like, okay, that's a decent commitment. But
Right.
these days, I just read somewhere recently that the person, that people that are born now, they're going to anticipate them to live to be 120. So,
Wow.
saying till
Yeah.
death do us part now at the age of 20, I mean, you could be married conceivably for 100 years, I
Yeah.
mean,
It's like an entirely different entity. It's like we're talking about something completely different than
right.
what marriage would have looked like even just 100 years ago.
Right, right. After I wrote this book and I talked with people about it, people would say, "Well, are you anti-marriage?" I'm not. I'm not anti-marriage or trying to be a buzzkill or anti-romantic or whatever. Uh,
Mhm.
I just want us to have realistic expectations about what we're talking about in marriage. And I think that's what I refer a lot to the book to a researcher named Eli Finkel out of
Mhm.
University of Michigan, and the work he's done in marriage. And essentially his argument, he kind of builds on that same book, Stephanie Kuhn's book. He read
Mm.
that book as well, and it kind of blew his mind. And he was like, here's how marriages evolved. We evolved initially to survive in marriage. That was sort of the goal. But then we kind of move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we begin to say, oh, okay, now that we're surviving, okay, you know, could we ask marriage to like maybe make us happy? Would that be
Mm.
possible? And then people, actually had happy marriages, and they were like that. And they said, okay. And they moved up a little bit more on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they said, I want marriage to make me self-actualized.
Mhm.
And Eli Finkel says, if you're relying on your spouse to make you self-actualized, that's putting a lot of weight on your spouse, to
Yeah.
depend on them for your happiness and to make you a complete human. And this is the Jerry Maguire marriage, right?
You
The
complete
scene
me.
where he gets in the elevator, and the woman says to the man in sign language, you complete me,
Mm.
and that's sort of the romantic notion, is like, oh, I find this person and they complete me, and I become self-actualized, because that's a lot of weight to put on somebody. and
Yeah.
and that's all I'm really trying to say in the book, is that let's try to be realistic about what we're saying here. When we
Right.
put this much weight on another human being, it's no wonder that 50% of marriages fail, you
Mm.
know because we've put so much weight on this, and such high expectations, that
Right.
it becomes really difficult.
And in a couple hundred years, we went from marriage being about this is a sexual partner to this should be a friend to now we're almost saying like this should be a therapist, someone who makes me a
Yeah,
better
yeah,
person.
yeah,
Real
exactly.
quick, because I should have stopped you when we started talking about this. Can you give a quick explanation of the Maslow's hierarchy? Because I'm guessing some
Oh,
of our
yes, of
listeners aren't
course.
familiar.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, researcher Abraham Maslow, and I would say in the 1940s, kind of came up with this psychological concept that human beings kind of operate out of what he calls a hierarchy of needs. In other words, we don't really talk about, we don't really think about like, hey, what are my friends doing this weekend when we don't have enough food to eat, right? So
Hmm.
we
Right.
focus first on like, We need air to breathe. That's sort of the very
Mhm.
bottom one, then we need food to eat. We need shelter over our head. Once we have these sort of basic human needs, then we begin to ask deeper questions about relationships
Mhm.
and happiness and those sorts of things, until we get to the very top of his pyramid, in which we ask about questions about ultimate meaning and how do I find my fit in the universe, and asking deeper spiritual questions and whatnot. So his point was simply that, we can't expect people to answer questions about deeper, more significant things when they're thinking about, I'm not sure I'm going to get the next meal. We're
Mhm.
focusing on that. So, and
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah,
And
that's
and
really
so
important.
so Eli Finkel says that's true in marriage too, right? When you're focusing on how do we survive, and we got to get the farming done, we got to run this farm so that we have enough food to eat, kind of thing. You're
Mhm.
not really asking the question of like, is my partner really meeting my needs psychologically? I
Right.
mean, you just don't care about that. You don't have room capacity in your mind to care for that. But once, we Americans, middle class Americans, we've got more than enough to eat. In fact, our problem is that we have too much to eat often,
Mhm.
and so our questions become, higher and higher on that thing. And the question I guess I'm driving at in the book is this: like, it used to be that we would sort of look to our friends and our neighbors and our relatives, our parents and siblings, to sort of fill the gap for all those sorts of things. And now we want our partner to be, share hobbies with us, to
Mm.
to be with us at every moment, and it just puts a lot of weight on the relationship.
I want to make sure that all of you listening catch on to what Dana's saying here, because it would be easy to miss the significance of talking about that hierarchy, because I think so often we look at marriages, say back like 1950s and before, and there's this stereotype of Leave It to Beaver and all these
Hmm.
different TV shows where it just seems like, oh, they marriage was so different back then. People committed better. They actually stayed in it. It's like, well, they didn't always have the time to think on a deeper level of what was going on. I think of my own grandfather, who talks about growing up on a farm and saying that his dad would say, "All right, Bob, we're working half a day today, 12 hours." That's just in my grandparents' generation.
Right.
Yeah, think about how much time you lose if you don't have a dishwasher or a
Hmm.
clothes
Hmm.
dryer, all these different things. You don't have time to be sitting around and thinking about the psychological details of a relationship. You're just doing the things you have to do every day to survive. So
Right.
I think it's not straw man isn't the right word. It's this fake ideal that we've set up that never existed. And sometimes people didn't leave marriages because they legally couldn't, or because they
Right.
just practically couldn't. So it's
Exactly.
not necessarily
Exactly.
that we live in a time where people are more immoral or less committed. It might just be that we have given an opportunity for people to realize how messed up things have been for a really long time.
For a very long time, this patriarchal culture has kept women in often very unhealthy situations. And it's been in my life. I'm older than you, Colin, but quite a bit probably. But in my lifetime, it actually changed, in which a woman, when I was born, a woman could not open a checking account without her
Oh
husband's
wow,
permission.
that's crazy.
And yeah, or open a credit account, a credit card, or
Yeah.
whatever. I mean, so it's not so long ago that this is like, Middle Ages stuff. I mean, again,
Yep.
in my lifetime, this has changed. So if women have been, I think this is part of the thing about divorce, is that if you don't have a whole lot of options, you stay. Again, it gets back to
Hmm.
Maslow's thing, right? I mean, if anybody, man or woman, is in a relationship to where, like, you really don't have the option to leave. You don't have the financial resources to get out. You
Yeah.
don't get out. I mean,
Yep.
it's as simple as that. So I think that's, as you point out, I think that's kind of the thing beneath the thing that we don't often talk about, and we
Right. We
think that,
just look at the
oh,
statistics and we don't look
right,
at
right.
why the statistic is how it is.
What's wrong with people these days, that they don't know how to
Right.
commit to each other, kind of thing. When, yeah, in fact, it has to do with a lot of the outside forces that are playing in on that. So what I think is interesting too about those divorce statistics, and I kind of, in the footnotes or the end notes, I dig in a little deeper into it, and
Mhm.
obviously that 50% statistic is kind of, it's misleading and is an oversimplification, like
Mhm.
for first marriages have like a 35% chance of divorce, and second marriages are like 45%, or yeah, I mean, it goes up, by the time
Yeah.
you hit your third marriage, you have like an 80% chance of divorce or something like that, so depends on which marriage you're on, how old you are when you get married. And this is part of the reason that
Mm-hmm.
evangelicals are so high in the divorce rate, is they marry
Yep.
so young.
Yep.
So the younger you are, if you get married at 19 years old, the chances of you getting divorced is through the roof, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
if you're in your late 20s when you marry, or it's your first marriage and those sorts of things. And of course, your socioeconomic background, that plays a big part into it as well. Poverty, it turns out, it's really hard on marriages, it's really
Mm.
stressful, and it can drive people apart. And so
Yeah.
that 50% thing, we throw it out, but again, it's much, much more nuanced than that, but yeah, it's a tricky deal. But here, the funny thing though, Colin, too, that's really interesting is that the divorce rate's slowly ticking down. And
Mm.
I think the reason that it's ticking down is not that people suddenly are, figuring out how to commit to each other. It's that fewer people are getting married.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, the way they kind of calculate divorce rates, is kind of funny if you think about it. What they do is they'll say, so like, in the county that you live in, they go down to the county courthouse and they say, how many people filled out a marriage license this year, and they get that number. So, okay,
Mm-hmm.
10,000 people, filled out a marriage license. Okay, how many people filed for divorce this year in the county? Well,
Mm.
5,000. Oh, okay, well then it's a
Mm.
50% divorce rate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, okay. But you don't have a crystal ball to know, those 10,000 people who filed, got a marriage certificate. We don't know if they're going to marry or if they're going to divorce or stick it out, or,
True. Yeah.
so that's so how they measure that is kind of tricky too. So again, those statistics can be kind of odd. So that if fewer people are getting married, you can see then the divorce rate begins to go down, because still the same number of people are getting anyway.
Yeah, no, you touch on a lot there, and especially talking about like evangelical subculture, getting
Mm-hmm.
married young, that's 100% where I came from. I
Right.
was in Bible college, straight out of high school, and we had people that were basically sophomores in college and getting married. And it almost, I don't want to say it was pushed or encouraged, but it almost was, and it certainly
Mm-hmm.
wasn't discouraged.
For
It was
sure.
like the longer you wait, the worse it is. And I wish some people would have heard those statistics that you shared before jumping in too
Yeah.
fast. But we're talking here about some of the ways marriage has gone wrong. Let's talk a little bit about getting it right. Because I was taught growing up that life isn't a buffet. You don't get to pick and choose what you want. You
Mm-hmm.
have to stick within the established patterns that are there. But
Mm-hmm.
you actually used the buffet analogy positively,
I do.
and you
I
called
do.
it relationship anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So explain that a little bit, and tell us, why do you think that idea is better than just sticking to what's traditional?
Well, I'm not sure I'd use the phrase better. I think I would
Okay,
say, I want us to, I hope people can see that there are other options besides the quote unquote traditional way.
good.
The phrase relational anarchy is not original to me by any means. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard that phrase before. And I came
Hmm.
across it and kind of thought, oh, okay, this makes sense. And it's just sort of the notion that, there's that Disney script, you meet somebody, you date, you fall in love, you buy an engagement ring, you
Hmm.
get married, you have children, and it's sort of this escalator of like, everything that kind of comes, and
Yep.
and parents are really good at sort of asking, so what's the deal with this person? Like, where are you on this escalator? They don't say
Right.
escalator, but that's what they mean, like,
Yeah.
and even after you get married, everybody knows,
Yeah.
it's like, hey, when are the kids coming,
Yep.
on this thing? There's an escalator, there's a script that they want you
Mm.
to fall into. And relationship anarchy just says we don't believe in the script, we see it different, that you don't have to necessarily follow the script. So the menu that I kind of propose is that to begin to communicate about, like, what is it that when we say that we're going to spend our lives together, that we're going to be committed to each other, what is it that we're committed to, and what is it that we're not committed to?
Mm.
And I've known people, more than one couple, that for whatever reason, one of the partners is not very good with their money, and the
Mhm.
other partner's like, I love you, but I am not getting in this hot mess with you. We're going to have separate finances from the very beginning. And
Yeah.
so they have, separate checking accounts, and and it works for them because, it keeps the chaos out of their relationship and the conflict out of their relationship. And,
Mm.
so again, in most marriages, there's an assumption you get a joint checking account, you share everything, kind of thing. Well, this is a way to say, you know what? This is one area that we're carving out that we agree that we're not sharing this together. This is going to be a separate thing for us. That's one example. There's ways of, when you're a step parent, part of the negotiation you have to have is like, what's my role as a parent here? How will I
Mm.
parent? And I was a step parent for a while. How is it that I relate to these kids? I mean, do I
Mm.
relate the same as their biological father? What do they call me? What authority do I have to speak into their life? Can I discipline them? How can I discipline them? Those
Yeah.
sorts of questions you have to sort of negotiate as a step parent, right? And again, in a traditional escalator sort of relationship, you share the same biological kids, and you just have assumptions about those things, right? So there's a million ways in which, how do you share food? I mean, do you
Mm.
have the same diet? Do you have different diet? I mean, there's a million
Mm.
ways
Mhm.
in which there's compromises in a marriage in terms of, like, do we have the same hobbies? Do we have
Yeah.
different interests outside of the marriage? And what do we do about friends? How do we handle friends? How do we handle in-laws?
Yeah.
How do we relate to each other's parents, or what are the boundaries we set up? So every marriage is different. Every situation, and even within a marriage, throughout time, things change, right? The way in which we relate
Mm.
changes. And I think I relate in the book. There was a older couple I had in one of my congregations, and I remember reflecting, just thinking about, like, they'd been married like 60 years,
Mm.
and to think about, like, how their lives changed, and sort of the focal point of their marriage over the years, from early honeymoon stage to having young children, and how the children become the focal point of everything, and then the kids grow up, and now you're managing teenagers, and you're managing crises, and your parents die, and they got to manage with
Mm.
that, and somebody has a health crisis, and now we have to figure that out. Somebody gets laid off work, and we have to work through that together. And so the dynamics are constantly changing over those 60 years, but it's the same marriage, right? And kind of the rules
Mm.
kind of change throughout that. And
It's almost like the old ship of Theseus thing, right? Where the wood changes. Like, is it still the same ship? Yeah,
right,
the
right.
relationship has
Yeah. Oh,
changed over the
that's a
years.
great analogy. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it almost ends up it's the same thing, but it almost ends up being different because of how much you've changed.
Right. Right. So I think so I'm trying to just point in the book to let's talk about this. Let's just be
Yes.
explicit in terms of what our expectations are, because if we're not explicit about those things, then it can create a lot of problems, in terms of our expectations. Happiness equals expectation minus reality is sort of the
Mm.
phrase I've worked with a lot of my life. If we
Yeah.
have certain expectations, if we set too high expectations, it's easy to be disappointed in that. So
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? Go ahead and say that line one more time. I think some people need to
yeah.
catch that a second time over.
Happiness is expectation minus reality. And where I heard that in a really spiritual context? I heard it on NPR's Car Talk. He was he was talking about a Toyota Corolla, and that's a whole nother story. But
Yeah.
it's true in Toyota Corollas, and it's true in marriages too.
So
Uh,
good.
yeah.
I really appreciate your clarifying some of that because I can definitely imagine some people listening thinking, well, if you try to change anything about marriage, if you just open the door a crack, you're opening up for anything and everything being okay. I remember
Mhm.
being in school and hearing people say, well, if you change the definition of marriage, and this was usually in the context of gay marriage, but if you change anything, allow anything, how long is it going to be until people are marrying their dogs and their cats and their vacuum cleaners? but what you're showing is it's not that much of an either or. It's not exactly my way or everything is okay. Yeah, you're talking about something as simple as it could just be you don't share finances, or
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
you don't go to the in-laws every Christmas because your relationship with them is strained, or what. Like, this is not saying we're opening the door for every possible thing that could ever be called marriage. Like you even talk about in the book, that we still draw hard lines on things like pedophilia. Like, we're not just saying
Hmm. Hmm.
anything can happen.
Yeah.
It's just saying there's a big space between what we have right now and everything possible being okay.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Colin, I think it's the cookie cutter thing. I think that kills so many people is that feeling
Mm,
like they have to fit into a particular box, and that if they're not, they're doing it wrong. And I think that the history of marriage allows us, if we look back on it, we can say, okay, it's changed before and it's evolved before. How can we make it work better for us today?
mm.
And so I have a whole chapter in the book about form and function, and I
Ah,
think
yes,
that
I was
it's an
just about to get
important,
into that, so go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's an important theological distinction, and our mutual friend Tom Ord, helped me kind
Mm,
of think through this. When we think about outward expressions of something, when we look at something like marriage, we often look at the outward expressions of it, and we
mm,
try to judge it on its merits based on its outward expressions, its form. But the better question to ask is not like what does it look like on the outside, but how does it function? What does it look like? Does it bring love and wholeness and
mm,
completeness to the people that are involved in it or not? That seems to be a better question than what the outward form is. Maybe
mm.
a way to kind of think of this analogously that's outside of the marriage context. If you think about parenting, anybody who's had
Mm.
more than one kid, you know that every kid's unique, right? And they're all
Yeah.
different. And like I had my firstborn kid was one of those kids that popped out of the womb and was like, how can I help you? Really, how can I serve you, make your life easier, And she was
Oh,
so easy and so wonderful. And it just, was super easy. The next kid popped out and it was, believe it or not like that. And we thought we had it all
right,
figured out. We thought we're really good parents. This is really
right,
easy.
right.
We should write books on parenting because we're so good at this.
Yeah.
And then, the next kid comes along and we said, oh, okay. I tell people jokingly when my oldest daughter hit adolescence, we thought, what's the big deal about teenagers? I don't understand why everybody's so worked up about having a teenager. This is easy. And then the second one hit and we're like, oh, I get it. I
That's what they
understand
mean.
now. I get it now. Yeah. So we related to them differently, not because we love them differently, right? But
Yeah.
the outward forms were different, but the inward expression was the same. So there were times
Mm.
that my kids needed different things from me. Sometimes they needed a hug. Sometimes they needed a swift kick in the pants. Sometimes they needed $20. Sometimes
Yeah.
they needed a new pair of pants. I mean,
Yeah.
all the outward forms of what they needed were different, but my motivations were always the same. I loved them and I wanted the best for them. I wanted the best outcomes for them, right? So the forms always followed my expression of love for them. And so in the same is true as in marriage. We often look at the outward forms and say,
Mm.
man, this marriage is a good marriage or a bad marriage. They don't sleep in the same bedroom. This must be a bad marriage, right?
Mm.
But why are they not sleeping in the same bedroom? I have a relative, he's got sleep apnea, and
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
wife was finally just like, out. you know, that's it.
Yep.
Well, again, if you're following the script, a good marriage is people who sleep in the same bedroom. Well, I mean, they had a bad marriage apparently, but
Yeah.
again, without looking at the forms without looking at the function, I think messes us up. We have to look kind of deeper at how does this function in their marriage to bring love and wholeness into their marriage.
At
So
first,
this,
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, at first, I think that can sound a little scary to people
Hmm.
that maybe have only heard of it one way, but I actually see that as one of the most life-giving things that you say in the book, because where I came from, you very much had this one form that you have to fit. And I think of something even as simple, and this may sound some of you listening may get this, others of you are going to go, really? Like, yes, really. This happened. In Bible college, if you were dating, it was pushed on you that, I mean, if you just started dating yesterday, you're doing daily devotions together as a couple. And that
Nice.
did not work for me and my now wife, but girlfriend at the
Yeah.
time, Jana. We learned really fast that doesn't work for us. We do not do well just like sitting together and trying to read a devotional. That doesn't mean that we didn't care about our faith or our faith together. We talk about it, but just sitting down and trying to fit that form actually drove us further away from it. And
Hmm.
it's a
Hmm.
stupid example maybe, but just because of the environment it was in, it shows how, like you say, the form needs to follow the function. The function is a good idea. Let's talk about our faith together. Let's try to have this, time where we can talk deeply together. That's a good thing. But
Hmm.
the form that can take can be different.
Yeah, and I think I think that's a really good example, Colin, of like the
Mm,
way in which we freight marriage with, not only will you be my co-parent, financial partner, roommate, all these other things, but you're going to be my spiritual mentor as well.
yes, yeah,
That's a lot to put on one person, all those roles,
yeah.
and maybe that works for some people, and that's great. But I think generally speaking, that's a really difficult thing for someone to be all those things to you.
Yeah. So let's imagine then that you have someone listening here, because I think this is going to represent most, maybe not most, but a good segment of the listeners, where they hear what you're saying,
Hmm.
but they've never really thought through that before.
Hmm.
And maybe they're already married or in a relationship. How would you suggest that they start thinking through the function that they want marriage to play and what forms are available in that? Like, if that's a category they've never considered, we can break out of this mold. What should be some of the first stuff that they're talking about with their partner or just thinking about themselves?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, this is a conversation to have with your partner. It's not a list of ultimatums to bring to your partner.
Right, right.
I would not suggest that. I think that could be very counterproductive to
Yeah.
say, I'm renegotiating this contract we have, and I'm done cooking. You're doing all the cooking
Right.
from now on, or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
I imagine this needs to be much more dialogue than monologue for sure.
Yeah.
But these aren't easy conversations, and this is one of the things I think
Mm.
that's hard, is that because this whole notion is ingrained so deep in us that the person that is my partner, my marriage partner, is going to be my everything. They're gonna
Mm.
they're gonna fulfill all the needs in my life. The day that I say, yeah, you're not fulfilling all the needs in my life, and I actually want to have a friend and go bowling with my buddy, that could
Yeah.
actually hurt someone's feelings, right? Because you're
Yeah.
saying, in a sense, you're inadequate, you're not
Mm.
enough, and again, it's a weird place to be all of a sudden. And so these conversations are not as easy as they sound sometimes, right? To say, look, I really need to have friends outside this marriage. I really need to have a support system outside this marriage. I don't want you to
Mm.
be my discipleship partner. I want
Yeah.
somebody else to be my discipleship partner, you know,
Right.
which is really healthy. These are really healthy boundaries to say,
Mm.
I don't need, you don't need you to be my everything. You can't be my everything. You can't be all of those things. There's some things you're really good at and that I want you to be at this, but you can't be everything. And so
Mm.
I think it's a hard conversation. And so I would enter into it full of grace and truth and love.
And you even provide in the book a couple of charts for talking through, like, who am I going to expect this part of the relationship to be fulfilled by? Or, using the, hey, I want to go bowling with my buddy illustration. Like, we all know that one couple that the second they became a couple or got married, everyone else is dead to them because now everything
Right.
is just about them. And it
Exactly.
sucks.
It
And not only
does.
does it
And
suck
it's
for the
not
rest of us, it
uncommon.
sucks for you
Yeah.
too. Like,
Hmm.
you might not realize it. You might think you're being lovey-dovey together, but it's going to drain your relationship because the other person can't provide all that.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
too, these conversations could be a way to dialogue over things that haven't been talked about in the relationship.
Yeah.
Like, if you're able to read this book with a partner, it gives you the opportunity to talk about things that maybe you've wanted to but never have
Yeah.
gotten to before.
yeah, these are hard conversations, and I don't want to pretend like they're easy, and we're kind of laughing about them, like, oh yeah, just do this, you know.
Right.
But these can be very fraught and lots of
Hmm.
landmines around them, but they can also be very freeing, like a lot of things, you know, nothing ventured, nothing gained kind of thing. But I think, and you haven't hit on it yet, Colin, but I think for
Good.
me, what I thought was the most controversial part of this book, you
Yeah.
know, was not just sort of talking about, you know, what our roles are, and, you know, people have different separate checking accounts and things like that, but thinking also in terms of our sexuality, and in terms of
Yeah.
what that looks like in a
All
modern
right. Yeah.
world in which
Let's go there.
what that looks like in a modern world in which, you know, we've got social media where we're reconnecting with old flames. And I tell a story in the book, and for me this was a huge shift in my thinking.
Mm.
There's a counselor that attended my church, and we were talking once, and just she was talking about couples that she does premarital counseling with, and she said, yeah, I mean, I do it way different than I used to do it 20 years ago. She said,
Mm.
with the advent of the internet, like, one of the things I have to talk to couples about now is, like, you know, before they get married, I always ask them, okay, let's define what cheating is,
Mm.
because everybody's got a different definition of cheating, and you don't want to figure out what your partner's definition of cheating is after they've done it.
Yep. Yeah.
And with the internet, there's a million ways that you can quote unquote cheat, or not, depending on what your
Yeah.
definition of cheating is. And
Yeah.
you'd better figure that out with your partner. Again, it's just the expectations, you know, happiness is expectations minus reality. And clear as kind is the other phrase, you know, that stole that from Brene Brown, right?
Yeah.
The clearer we are, the kinder we are. The clearer we
Mm.
are with our expectations of what those things are, the better. And so, you know, sexuality is another piece that is, again, that has a really interesting history in the history of marriage as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Touch on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, again, we tend to think, you know, again, have this sort of puritanical version of sexuality, you know, that has pretty much been around for the last 200 years. But the reality is that for most of marriage, I mean, you know, men, especially men in particular, you know, they had the right to kind of go and sleep with whoever they wanted, and the wives made the babies and stayed at home, kind of thing is sort of how it
Yep.
went, you know. And that was for most of human history. And marriage early on, especially right after the agricultural revolution, was a way in which men marked their property, you know, so that we knew who our descendants were when we passed on our property, our real estate,
Hmm.
you know, to the next generation. So yeah, there's misogyny mixed up in this. Obviously, there's a lot of history stuff. So there's in the book I talk about the monogamy problem, you know, that
Hmm.
that part of what's driven this divorce rate, you know, in romantic marriages, the marriages of the last 200 years, is this monogamy problem, that human beings aren't really particularly good at monogamy. Some of them are,
Yeah.
but many of them are not. And it isn't just that, you know, they're of poor character or whatever. I mean, it just, there seems to be
Hmm.
something ingrained in humanity that we have this monogamy problem. And so it's something that we have to talk about. And it, as uncomfortable as that is for couples, and again, this gets back to that conversation, what, I'm inadequate for you, sort of
Mm.
thing. Whether it's, you know, I don't want to bowl with you anymore, or, you know, I find other people attractive. Either way, they
Right.
feel inadequate, you know. I mean, there's that sense of
Yeah.
inadequacy. And so these are hard conversations, but I think important conversations. If people want to stay married for a long time, I think the monogamy problem is something they have to address. They have to be able to talk about, you know, how do we stay monogamous for 60 years, or,
Mm.
you know, what does that look like to be monogamous, or to stay true to each other, and you know, dialogue about that. And those aren't easy conversations. And And again, a lot of your listeners, like myself and you, came from a very traditional background. And I think that, the question, this is a really hard conversation if you come from a really conservative background, to
Yeah.
think about, well, anything, like you say, anything goes then, no, I don't think anything goes. I think that you need to have a conversation though, and talk about what this looks like, and figure it out for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It really does come back down so much to those expectations of so much that we don't communicate. Like you're talking about the internet there. And I have friendships that I'm sure some people would say, "Oh, that is an emotional affair," or cheating through texting on the. Okay, there's nothing sexual just because I talk to somebody else other than my wife sometimes does not automatically mean it's bad. But that's that purity culture mindset that we have. And that's something that, also my wife and I have talked about. So it's not like it's just me going off and doing whatever. But we have these expectations. Like, when I went to beer camp, Jana was out there with me, but she wasn't actually at beer camp because like you are going to nerd out about theology. You're going to, go do your thing, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But there are just so many couples that can't seem to think it's okay for that. And I think they want to. I think if they can get past the mental hurdle, they realize, oh, I don't have to be all that for the other person. It's
Yeah.
freeing, but there's just something that we have to get over. And you talk in the book about that in terms of purity culture too, which we were kind of skirting around a little bit in that conversation. But there's a part in the book where you get into some Freudian psychology language about men wanting to marry a mothering figure while simultaneously wanting to have sex with the proverbial whore. And for anyone listening that can't see air quotes here, that is psychological terminology. I'm not being rude. That is actually the term for this.
Yeah,
But
it was Freud's terminology. He called it the Madonna whore complex.
yes,
Madonna meaning like the mother of Jesus, not the 80s pop star.
right, right.
Uh,
But you compare that idea to purity culture and suggest that despite them coming from very different angles, they both actually end up at basically the same place. I'd love
yeah,
to hear
that,
you talk a little bit more about that.
and some of this was from my own experience, and this may be more information than your listeners wanted to hear. But I mean, growing up in that purity culture, it was that bifurcation in my mind between like women that I found attractive and women I respected.
Mm,
Which was
yeah,
really bizarre when I look
yeah.
back on it now. As an adolescent, this was sort of my thought process, and this is exactly what Freud was getting at. Like, we respect the Madonna, but we want to sleep with the whore. And
Hmm.
and that women are either one of two things. They're either an object of our desire or somebody that we respect. And this, of course, is patriarchal stuff that runs so deep, and it's cultural things that aren't even conscious of a lot of times. And I mean, we can go on for hours about the layers of
Yeah,
all this, including the election that just happened, all that
yeah.
kind of thing. But yeah, this becomes part of the Christian purity culture that comes out of this as well, right? That we don't respect, and I'm speaking from a male
Yeah.
perspective, and I'm not, and again, I'm not saying this is right. In fact, I'm saying this is quite wrong. But there's this undercurrent of, you don't respect people that you have sex with, and
Mm,
you respect people that you don't have sex with, and
mm,
or desire. And well, that makes for a messed up marriage if you're
hmm.
gonna, if
And that's
that's what you're
really
talking about.
coming back with Gen Z, with some online communities like Andrew Tate sort of people, as 100% that mindset that's
Oh, is
that's
that right?
seeping in again. Yeah. So I think that's a really important conversation to need to have and to think about that on your own. Like, why am I thinking this way, or how am I thinking this way? Maybe without even realizing it,
Yeah.
because like you brought out, it's actually it's damaging and it's degrading. I think to the women in our lives as well.
Yeah, to both men and women,
Yeah.
it's dehumanizing. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, which is a weird thing that we've done with sex. If you take a step
Mm,
back from it, like this beautiful, wonderful, joy creating sort of thing, we've I mean, politicized it, with a small p. I mean,
mm,
just like we've made it in such a weird twist on it, that yeah, we think about it all just all messed up.
yeah. And so much of that deals with purity culture, which, like you said, that's hours of other conversations right there.
Yeah, yeah.
but it's really just the flip side of that same coin. In church you hear about pornography objectifying women, and really purity culture is just the other side of that. No one
Yeah.
talks about sex more than evangelical Christians that don't want you to have it.
That's right. Exactly true. Yeah.
So, thinking here about people who are already married
Hmm.
and reading your book or listening to us talk here, I think a lot of people listening are in various stages of reconsidering their faith.
Hmm.
So this whole idea of coming at marriage from a different angle and having that relationship anarchy, how do you think that might speak into a couple that is realizing their faith has changed over the years, and the way the stuff they believed when they started out together isn't the same stuff they believe now?
Yeah, so they're deconstructing at different rates, maybe. Is that what you mean,
Yeah, yeah,
Colin?
something along those lines. Like I think
Yeah.
there's just kind of this idea a lot of people have of, well, if one person changes, it's over. Like, oh, they're not the same person I married.
Mm.
They're no longer a Christian, or they're not my flavor of Christian anymore, or whatever. Like, could
Mhm.
some of this speak into that and maybe say that the function can outlive the form, and there might actually be more here than just matching up beliefs?
Yeah, if the only glue that was holding you together was this sort of shared fundamentalist theology, then
Mm,
once you lose that, that's pretty frightening in terms of the marriage of what's left. I agree. I mean, and if the entire assumptions of the marriage were based on that, it can be kind of a scary place to be for people. I don't envy people in these
mm.
conversations, and I should probably give the disclaimer: I am not a professional therapist, and you should seek one
Sure.
out. you
Yeah.
know, and I've, in all seriousness, I've found a lot of help with therapists, and I would recommend that to folks that are really struggling. Find someone good. If the first one you go to is terrible, go to the next, find another one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think deconstruction can be really hard. And I've had friends that, they're married to somebody, they're kind of deconstructing at a different pace. And
Hmm.
one is still like kind of deep in a fundamentalist world, and the other is like ready to throw it all in. And
Hmm.
and now they have to talk about how are we going to raise our kids. And these
Yes.
get
Yeah.
really fraught conversations, and they get really messy. And I don't have easy answers for that. And if I did, I could write another book and make a lot of money. But but those, I mean, I all I can say is, man, I feel your pain, and I don't know that there's any way easy out but through. And sometimes endings are beginnings.
Mm.
I think that, and that's not very optimistic, I know, but
Mm.
it's the truth. And I've been divorced, and I've counseled with people who've had to kind of wrestle through whether to stay or go in all kinds of different situations. And there's always different dynamics. There's kids at play, there's financial situations at work, and these things. And so every situation's different.
Mm.
But to me, I think part of the question that I always ask people, as they're wrestling with this, is like, you've got a lot of bad options in front of you. What's the best of all the bad options?
Mm.
5 years from now, what's a decision that you'll be really glad you made?
Mm.
Not
Yeah.
not sitting here in the pain that you're in right now, but 5 years from now, what's a decision that you're going to be really glad that you made today? And I think, maybe those can help provide a little bit of clarity in terms of a way forward.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the best of a lot of bad decisions is that this thing is done.
Mm.
And 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 it sucks, and it's going to hurt. I was having a conversation on a different podcast earlier this week,
Mm.
Colin, and we were talking about, identity and politics, and how when our identity gets wrapped up in something, how hard it is to sort of let it go, because when
Hmm.
people attack, like fundamentalism is a great example of that. We identify as fundamentalist or Christian in some way, and people attack that. We feel like they're attacking us, and it becomes really, we get real defensive about it. But I think,
You
and
actually
I
have a
mentioned this.
quote really similar to that in your book somewhere here.
Oh,
I know I starred it when I saw it. Keep talking, and I'll let you know when I find it here.
yeah, yeah. Well, so what part of the conversation I had earlier this week is I said, man, this was the hard part about divorce, is that is that it's a sense of your sense of identity of who you are gets just rocked to the core. Women change their last names to get married. I mean, talk about
Yeah.
change of identity, right? And now you get divorced, and what, you're going to change your name back? I mean, talk about, I mean, again, it's just so painful to go through that. And I don't wish it on anyone. But that being said, it's also sometimes the best of a lot of bad options in cases of abuse, in cases of,
absolutely,
those sorts of things. So anyway, it's complicated, it's messy, and every situation is different. But
true.
For your listeners who are going through that and feel like they're not on the same page with their partner and this whole deconstruction thing, man, I feel you, and it's tough. And
Yeah.
it might be worth it to keep being patient. Yeah, your partner. I don't know.
Yeah, I did find the quote. It's chapter 5, Thomas Merton. When I criticize a system, they think I criticize them, and that is, of course, because they fully accept the system and identify themselves with it.
I love Thomas Merton.
Yeah,
He's
that's
so
great.
wise.
No, I appreciate that you said that in such an honest way, because I know in the circles that I came from, divorce was really frowned upon, and it was barely even allowed in cases of abuse. Like I definitely know of people who were told to stay in really bad marriages because God hates divorce. So I think hearing someone speak realistically and say sometimes, like you said, an end is a new beginning. It's saying you're not broken, and this isn't the end of the road. I think even too, just talking about like form and function, like maybe the form can change if
Yeah.
we can still get behind the same function together. Like
Right.
there's a couple I can think of where, yeah, they've been married for a long time and their beliefs change to the point that, one is fundamentalist, the other doesn't even consider themselves a Christian, and they fight over stuff. I'm like, at the end of the day, your values are actually really similar. It's just your religious beliefs have changed. So if you could base the marriage around your shared values instead of the religious beliefs, you guys would be great.
Right.
But we just get so stuck in this idea of the form that it's currently in that sometimes we don't step back and say, well, can we actually just change the form around a little bit and share the same function?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's so true.
If we can back that up, because we talked a little bit to some married couples there, if you could imagine a couple sit in front of you that they're dating, they're in love, and they're considering getting married. This is the only meeting that you're going to get with them.
Run away. No, I'm just kidding.
And so what would you make sure that they know going in? Obviously, there's only so much you can say, but if there's like one thing that you wanted to get across to someone that they've got everything ahead of them, they haven't made the mistakes that so many people have made yet, what do you think would be most useful for them to hear?
Yeah, I think the most useful thing to talk about is, like we talked about earlier in this conversation, is that, hey, you guys are going to be together maybe 40 years, maybe even 50,
Hmm.
60 if you're lucky, and you're going to have 60 different marriages in that time. It's going to
Yeah.
be every season of your life is going to be different. And you just got to go into it knowing we're going to constantly be adjusting, we're constantly going to be changing, we're constantly going to be changing our expectations for each other and what we
Hmm.
want from each other, what we need from each other at different seasons in this marriage. And as long as we go into it knowing that, they're like, oh, okay, we're in a new season, we just turned the page on a new chapter,
Hmm.
and now we need to start this new chapter, and the rules have slightly changed, and we're going to
Hmm.
adjust. You'll probably be okay. It's the people that go
Yeah.
in thinking this is a static thing, where it's a cookie
Hmm.
cutter thing, or it's a one size fits all thing, and it's got to fit into this box or this escalator or whatever metaphor you want to use. Those are the people that really, I think, struggle, because
Hmm.
there's no play in it. There's no ability to flex when the pressures come.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. I wish I had heard that because it took me the first probably couple of years of being married to realize that. And I was constantly trying to fit us into a mold that we as individuals didn't.
Yeah.
and as a couple didn't either. And we had to figure out what works for us. I, yeah, I think that's just so important for people to hear is like this is not suggesting we completely overhaul marriage because every marriage out there sucks. Like you are not here telling people what you've got is bad. But I think what you're trying to do is say a lot of us, if we're actually honest with ourselves deep down in our hearts, we feel like we don't fit this mold, especially in an evangelical culture where we're constantly being preached at this is what marriage should be. And especially if you come from like a complementarian style of church where the man has to be this hierarchical leader. I think this gives a lot of freedom for people to say, oh, I don't have to fit some other person's mold to please God or to have a good marriage. We can have flexibility in how we pursue this. And I think you even say in the book to center everything on love, right? Because I heard a big Tom Ward voice speaking through you there. It's like keep
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
as the center of this, whatever
Right.
form that might take.
Right. Right.
Mm,
Yeah. If we, the question isn't about form, it's about how to create the most loving way of doing this. And that
yeah.
looks different all the time, because we
Yeah.
change, our circumstances change.
Yeah. How might you suggest someone who takes a little bit of a different approach to marriage talk with people who aren't as understanding of that, particularly if they have family, maybe coming from a religious background where
Mm.
there's just something about the way that they do their relationship together, maybe not getting married or not, having
Mhm.
marriage the way that people think they should. How can someone start to have conversations about that in a healthy way with people who maybe don't understand it as well?
So as you're talking, I'm thinking about like my oldest daughter, she's dating this guy and they've been
Mm,
dating for, a little over a year now. He's a nice guy. I really like him.
yeah.
And but she's at an age now, she's in her late 20s. No, wait, she's
Mm,
30. She's
mm.
over 30. Gosh, I'm getting old. Anyway, it's like I just so instinctually want to say, hey, when are you guys going to tie a knot and give me a grandbaby? I mean, I
Mm.
want them to climb that escalator for my sake,
Right?
because of
Yeah.
my needs and my wants, in this
Mm.
situation. And I think that I just say all that to say, I wrote the darn book, here's the
Right.
I
Yeah.
wrote the book on this, but it's still ingrained in me, to think this way.
Yeah.
So I guess in some ways I'm trying to say, be patient with your parents. This stuff runs deep. It runs really deep in us and all of us. And we need to be patient with ourselves and with the others and gracious and those sorts of things and understand that the idea of the romantic marriage is so
Mm,
deeply ingrained and this relationship escalator so deeply ingrained in us that it's really hard to escape it. It's really hard to sort of step outside it and allow
mm,
people to be what they're gonna be because we just often selfishly have those expectations. So that being said, I'm not sure there's an easy way. It's just like anybody, really. I was telling somebody the other day, I wrote my second book's on deconstruction, and I
mhm.
realized really this first book, The Knot, is about a deconstruction of marriage. And I thought, oh, it's
Mm.
probably a better way of marketing it to talk about deconstructing marriage, but but just like any all that to say, just like any deconstruction, right? It's hard to talk about, and it's hard for people on the outside to understand that
Mm,
you're kind of going through a process of rethinking things. G.K. Chesterton has this great quote. He was
mm,
a writer, a
mhm,
19th century writer in England, and he has this great quote like that the primary task of education is not learning but unlearning. And
mm,
and I think that speaks to me in terms of like people who are getting smarter are unlearning things. And I think that
mm.
if you can communicate that in some way to the people that are closest to you to say, you know what, the good news is I'm getting smart. The bad news is I'm unlearning some things that you might still believe. And
Yeah.
so you're going to have to be patient with me and I'm going to have to be patient with you as we go through this process because the object of education is not always to learn new things. It's often to unlearn bad things. And
Uh,
and so, whether it's ideas of marriage or God or the Bible or spirituality or whatever it
yeah.
might be, we're unlearning and learning at the same time.
Love it. I think we actually just found our soundbite for the episode right there too. And I think too, for anyone listening, like wherever you may be in life, whether you're in a relationship or not, whether you've ever been married or not, I think that the principles that Dana talks about in the book are really helpful just to have in your mind. There was someone that I was just talking to this past week where I said, read the knot, but read it through the lens of church every time he talks about marriage. And think and think about it from these different angles, and like how might the form of my spirituality need to change in order to just
Oh,
stay at
that's
the
good.
function there. Dana, it has been a pleasure talking to you, and we could definitely keep going on for hours more, but unfortunately we're coming
Yeah.
close to time here. So
Oh, I
with
appreciate
the
it. What a
last
great conversation.
and really good material. So thank you for sharing this with me when we met back in Colorado. And
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Like I have no problem recommending this book,
Oh,
aside from
good.
saying it
Thank
will
you.
make you uncomfortable, but in a good way and in a much
Yeah.
needed way.
Yeah, good.
So last few minutes here, I just want to hand over to you. Any final comments you want to make? Feel free to do any shameless plugs, books, podcasts, anything you're working on, and let
Yeah.
people know where they can find you.
Yeah. Well, when we met back in Colorado, Colin, and you told me about your podcast, I really thought that this book was a
Mm,
good fit for your podcast. Like I told you, just because there's a lot of Bible in this, and kind of more in your niche, I think.
yeah.
But my more recent book that just came out this fall is The Quest for Thin Places. It's a book on deconstruction, and
Yeah.
so that's my shameless plug. For that one. It's how to find spirituality after deconstruction. And so kind of
Mm,
talking about you've deconstructed, now what, and I've kind of
yeah.
observed sometimes people they deconstruct and then they become part of some stuff that's just like as toxic as the thing they left, because they're
Mm,
still
yep.
in those mindsets of I don't know, fundamentalist, stuff runs deep
Yeah.
too, so how do we kind of we've deconstructed, now what do we fill that void with, I guess, and so I try to hopefully provide a path forward for
Oh,
folks on that. But
that's great. I can't wait to read that one.
yeah, yeah. So the other thing I want to make sure and say, Connor, is that I really want to encourage our listeners to stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
Love it. Dr. Dana Hicks, thank you for your time with us here today.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.